I'm Tristen Law, semi-retired pro wrestler. Welcome to Pro Wrestling Quickie. Chris Jericho recently said that AEW may not have been able to start without him. And I know how that sounds. Depending on how you feel about Jericho, you might hear that and say, there he goes again. But I don't think that this is just his ego talking. I think there's some truth to this. Because AEW didn't just need good wrestlers when it started. AEW needed some legitimacy. And Chris Jericho gave them that. He said, without him or Tony Khan, AEW might not have been able to start. He wasn't saying he built AEW by himself. He was saying AEW needed key pieces at the right time. Tony Khan was one of those pieces. Chris Jericho was one of those pieces. And honestly, I think he's right. Here's the part that some people miss. AEW didn't specifically need Chris Jericho. AEW needed a Chris Jericho caliber star. They needed somebody with star power and somebody who's been on national TV. They needed someone casual fans already knew. They needed someone you could put in a main event and not have to convince the audience that they belong there. That was Jericho. You didn't have to picture Chris Jericho as a main eventer. You already saw him as one. Former WWE World Champion, WWE's first undisputed champion, defeating both Stone Cold and The Rock in the same match. Jericho has big match experience, years of television, years of reinvention from Y2J to adding people to the list. A name that meant something beyond the hardcore wrestling bubble. And that matters when you're launching a new company. In the beginning, AEW had the excitement. They had Cody Rhodes, Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, and they had Tony Khan's money. They had a fan base that wanted something different from the WWE. But they still needed that face that made people outside of the internet wrestling world say, okay, this is Major League. That was Chris Jericho. He was the familiar face that helped make the new and unfamiliar company feel familiar. That doesn't mean AEW was the Chris Jericho show. That doesn't mean Cody Rhodes, the Young Bucks, Kenny Omega, and Tony Khan didn't matter either. AEW was not built by one person. But when you're trying to start a national wrestling promotion in the same environment as WWE, perception is everything. You can have great matches, you can have great ideas, you can have the cool fan base. But if the average wrestling fan looks at your top act and says, who's this supposed to be? Now you've got to spend time teaching them. AEW didn't have to teach people who Chris Jericho was. That's why Jericho's role matters. And I look at it almost like Hogan going to WCW. Now hold on, before everybody goes crazy, let me be clear. I'm not saying that Chris Jericho was Hulk Hogan. That's not the point. I'm talking about the function. Hogan gave WCW something it needed: mainstream wrestling credibility. A former top WWF guy walking into WCW changed how people treated the company. It made WCW feel bigger. It made WCW feel like a real threat to Vince McMahon and his WWF. Jericho served a similar function in AEW. Not the same level or same drawing power as Hulk Hogan, but the same kind of job. He was the established star who made AEW feel like a major league player. And everybody needs to be fair about that. You don't have to love Jericho in every segment. You don't have to pretend that every Jericho story has worked. You don't even have to want him on TV every week. But if we're talking about AEW's launch, you cannot erase what he brought to the table. AEW had to be very careful in the beginning. They needed WWE level credibility without feeling like a WWE ripoff. And that's a hard line to walk in this day and age. If AEW launched with too many former WWE names on top, fans would have called it a knockoff. They would have said, oh, this is where the WWE rejects go to die. Chris Jericho's different. He had WWE credibility, but he also had enough history outside of WWE that he still felt like a wrestling superstar. Not just a WWE leftover, he had WCW history, credibility in Japan, he was in ECW, he already had shown he could reinvent himself. So when he came to AEW, it didn't feel like AEW was borrowing WWE's identity. It felt like AEW landed a real star. Could CM Punk have filled that role? Probably. Could Randy Orton have filled that role? Absolutely. Could Brock Lesnar have done it? Maybe, but Brock's a little different kind of attraction. Without the right person speaking for him, and honestly without someone as good as Paul Heyman, it could have felt like a parody of what was already working someplace else. And a lot of those names I just mentioned, We're not realistic at the time anyway. Jericho was available, credible, and believable. Jericho was the right guy at the right time. So when he says AEW may not have been able to start without him, I don't hear ego. I hear pride. I hear a veteran who knows what his name meant in that moment. Everybody's not equal when you're trying to build something. Some people bring good matches while some bring buzz. Some bring money, some bring television experience. Some people bring credibility the second they walk through that curtain. That was Jericho. He brought that credibility. But this is where the conversation now changes. What AEW needed from Chris Jericho in 2019 is not the same thing AEW should need from Chris Jericho today. In 2019, Jericho's value was legitimacy. Now his value should be growth. He should be an attraction, a final boss for the younger guy, a special feud, a big dynamite presence, a pay-per-view name. Someone who makes the moment feel bigger but doesn't make the entire story about himself. If Jericho is working with a younger talent, that younger talent has to become the point, not Jericho. If Jericho's holding the championship, the question has to be, who is this setting up? Who gets elevated? Who beats him and who walks away bigger? If Jericho's leading a faction, the question has to be, who in that group becomes more valuable because of Chris Jericho? A veteran-led faction should not just orbit the veteran. It should create tomorrow. That is what Jericho's role should be in today's AEW. He's had more matches behind him than in front of him. And that's not an insult. That's straight up reality. He loves AEW and pro wrestling. And you can tell, he takes pride in being part of the company's foundation. But the best thing a veteran can do for a company he helped build is to make sure the company doesn't always need him. AEW needed Chris Jericho to feel real. Now Jericho's greatest value is helping AEW feel real without him. That's the full circle. So was Jericho wrong? No, I don't think he was wrong. AEW needed somebody of his caliber, and Cody Rhodes, Kenny Omega, and the Young Bucks couldn't do it. Maybe it didn't have to be Chris Jericho, specifically, but it had to be someone with a level of star power, TV experience, and casual fan familiarity. Jericho helped AEW feel like the real deal before AEW had enough history to stand on its own. But AEW's next step is continued growth. And by growth, it means the people who helped start the company eventually push the company beyond them. That's how wrestling survived generations. That's how stars are made. This is how a company becomes bigger than its launch story. Chris Jericho deserves credit for helping start AEW. But the next chapter should not be about proving AEW needed Jericho back then. It should be about Jericho helping AEW build the future that does not need him forever. I'm Tristen, and that's your Pro Wrestling Quickie.